Hey, 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 friends! It's time for another chapter of our The Body in the Library, a Miss Marple mystery. Chapter 3. In his office at Much Benham, Colonel Melchett received and scrutinized the reports of his subordinates. So it all seems clear enough, sir, Inspector Slack was concluding. Mrs. Bantry sat in the library after dinner and went to bed just before 10. She turned out the lights when she left the room, and presumably no one entered the room afterwards. The servants went to bed at 10:30, and Lorimer, after putting the drinks in the hall, went to bed at 11:15. Nobody heard anything out of the usual except the third housemaid, and she heard too much. Groans and a blood-curdling yell and sinister footsteps and I don't know what. The second housemaid, who shares a room with her, says the other girl slept all night through without a sound. It's those ones that make up things that cause us all the trouble. What about the forced window? Amateur job, Simmons says, done with a common chisel. Ordinary pattern wouldn't have made much noise. Ought to be a chisel about the house, but nobody can find it. Still, that's common enough where tools are concerned. Think any of the servants know anything? Rather unwillingly, Inspector Slack replied. No, sir, I don't think they do. They all seem very shocked and upset. I had my suspicions of Lorimer. Reticent he was, if you know what I mean, but I don't think there's anything in it. Melchett nodded. He attached no importance to Lorimer's reticence. The energetic Inspector Slack often produced that effect on people he interrogated. The door opened and Dr. Haydock came in. Thought I'd look in and give you the rough gist of things. Yes, glad to see you. Well, nothing much, just what you'd think. Death was due to strangulation. Satin waistband of her own dress, which was passed around the neck and crossed at the back, quite easy and simple to do, wouldn't have needed great strength. That is, if the girl were taken by surprise. There are no signs of a struggle. What about time of death? Say between 10 and midnight. You can't get nearer than that? Haydock shook his head with a slight grin. I won't risk my professional reputation. Not earlier than 10 and not later than midnight. And your own fancy inclines to which time? Depends. There was a fire in the grate, the room was warm, all that would delay rigor and cadaveric stiffening. All that would delay. Anything more you can say about her? Nothing much. She was young, about 17 or 18, I should say, rather immature in some ways, but well developed muscularly. Quite a healthy specimen. She was a Virgo intacta, by the way. And with a nod of his head, the doctor left the room. Melchett said to the inspector, You're quite sure she'd never been seen before at Gossington? The servants are positive of that, quite indignant about it. They'd have remembered if they'd seen her about in the neighborhood, they say. Fruity tea. I expect they would, said Melchett. Any one of that type sticks out a mile round here. Look at that young woman of Blake's. Pity it wasn't her, said Slack. Then we should be able to get on a bit. It seems to me this girl must have come down from London, said the chief constable thoughtfully. Don't believe there would be any local leads. In that case, I suppose we should do well to call in the yard. It's a case for them, not for us. Something must have brought her down here, though, said Slack. He added tentatively, Seems to me Colonel and Mrs. Bantry must know something. Of course, I know they're friends of yours, sir. Colonel Melchett treated him to a cold stare. He said stiffly, You may rest assured that I'm taking every possibility into account. every possibility, he went on. You've looked through the list of persons reported missing, I suppose. Slack nodded. He produced a typed sheet. Got 'em here. Mrs. Saunders reported missing a week ago. Dark-haired, blue-eyed, 36. 'Tisn't her. And anyway, everybody knows, and everyone knows, except her husband, that she's gone off with a fella from Leeds. Commercial. Mrs. Bannard, she's 65. Pamela Reeves, 16, missing from her home last night. Had attended Girl Guide rally. Dark brown hair and pigtail, 5'5". Melchett said irritably, "Don't go on reading idiotic details, Slack. This wasn't a schoolgirl. In my opinion," he broke off as the telephone rang. "Hello? Yes? Yes, Much Benham Police Headquarters. What?" "Just a minute." He listened and wrote rapidly, then he spoke again, a new tone in his voice. "Ruby Keene, 18, occupation professional dancer, 5'4", slender, platinum blonde hair, blue eyes, some kind of nose, it's in French. Believed to be wearing white diamond, another French word. Evening dress, silver sandal shoes. Is that right?" "What?" "Yes, not a doubt of it. I should say I'll send Slack over at once." He rang off and looked at his subordinate with rising excitement. "We've got it, I think." That was the Glenshire police. Glenshire was the adjoining county. Girl reported missing from the Majestic Hotel, Danemouth. "Danemouth?" said Inspector Slack. "That's more like it." Danemouth was a large and fashionable watering place on the coast not far away. "It's only a matter of 18 miles or so from here," said Chief Constable. "The girl was a dance hostess or something at the Majestic. Didn't come on to do her turn last night. The management were very fed up about it. When she was still missing this morning, one of the other girls got the wind up about her, or someone else did. It sounds a bit obscure. You'd better go over to Danemouth at once, Slack. Report there to Superintendent Harper and cooperate with him." Activity was always to Inspector Slack's taste. To rush off in a car to silence rudely these people who were anxious to tell him things, to cut short conversations on the plea of urgent necessity, all this was the breath of life to Slack. In an incredibly short time, therefore, he had arrived at Danemouth, reported at police headquarters, had a brief interview with a distracted and apprehensive hotel manager, and leaving the latter with the doubtful comfort of "got to make sure it is this girl first before we start raising the wind," was driving back to Much Benham in company with Ruby Keene's nearest relative. He had put through a short call to Much Benham before leaving Danemouth, so the chief constable was prepared for his arrival, though not perhaps for the brief introduction of "This is Josie, sir." Colonel Melchett stared at his subordinate coldly. His feeling was that Slack had taken leave of his senses. The young woman who had just got out of the car came to the rescue. "That's what I'm known as professionally," she explained with a momentary flash of large, handsome white teeth. "Raymond and Josie, my partner and I call ourselves. Of course, all the hotel know me as Josie. Josephine Turner's my real name." Colonel Melchett adjusted himself to the situation and invited Miss Turner to sit down, meanwhile casting a swift professional glance over her. She was a good-looking woman of perhaps nearer 30 than 20. her looks depending more on skillful grooming than actual features. She looked competent and good-tempered with plenty of common sense. She was not the type that would ever be described as glamorous, but she had nevertheless plenty of attraction. She was discreetly made up and wore a dark tailor-made suit. Though she looked anxious and upset, she was not, the colonel decided, particularly grief-stricken. As she sat down, she said, "It seems too awful to be true. Do you really think it's Ruby?" "That, I'm afraid, is what we've got to ask you to tell us. I'm afraid it may be rather unpleasant for you." Miss Turner said apprehensively, "Does she look very terrible?" "Well, I'm afraid it may be rather a shock to you." He handed her his cigarette case, and she accepted one gratefully. Do you want me to look at her right away?" "It would be best, I think, Miss Turner. You see, it's not much good asking you questions until we're sure." "Best get it over, don't you think?" "All right." They drove down to the mortuary. When Josie came out after a brief visit, she looked rather sick. "It's Ruby, all right," she said shakily. "Poor kid. Goodness, I do feel queer." "There isn't," she looked around wistfully, "any gin?" Gin was not available, but brandy was, and after gulping a little down, Miss Turner regained her composure. She said frankly, "It gives you a turn, doesn't it? See anything like that? Poor little Rube. What swine men are, aren't they?" "You believe it was a man?" Josie looked slightly taken aback. "Wasn't it?" "Well, I mean, naturally, I thought." "Any special man you were thinking of?" She shook her head vigorously. "No, not me. I haven't the least idea. Naturally, Ruby wouldn't have let on to me if what?" Josie heard hesitation. No, Josie hesitated. "Well, if she'd been going about with anyone." Melchett shot her a keen glance. He said no more until they were back at his office. Then he began, "Now, Miss Turner, I want all the information you can give me." "Yes, of course. Where shall I begin?" "I'd like the girl's full name and address, her relationship to you, and all you know about her." Josephine Turner nodded. Melchett was confirmed in his opinion that she felt no particular grief. She was shocked and distressed, but no more. She spoke readily enough. Her name was Ruby Keene, her professional name, that is. Her real name was Rosie Legge, Legge. Her mother was my mother's cousin. I've known her all my life, but not particularly well, if you know what I mean. I've got a lot of cousins, some in business, some on the stage. Ruby was more or less training for a dancer. She had some good engagements last year in panto and that sort of thing. Not really classy, but good provincial companies. Since then, she's been engaged as one of the dancing partners at the Palace Dance in Brixwell, South London. It's a nice, respectable place, and they look after the girls well, but there isn't much money in it." She paused. Colonel Melchett nodded. "Now this is where I come in. I've been dancing bridge hostess at the Majestic in Dannemouth for 3 years. It's a good job, well paid and pleasant to do. You look after people when they arrive, size them up, of course. Some like to be left alone, and others are lonely and want to get into the swing of things. You try to get the right people together for bridge and all that, and get the young people dancing with each other. It needs a bit of tact and experience." Again, Melchett nodded. He thought that this girl would be good at her job. She had a pleasant, friendly way with her, and was, he thought, shrewd without being in the least intellectual. "Besides that," continued Josie, "I do a couple of exhibition dances every evening with Raymond. Raymond Starr, he's the tennis and dancing pro. Well, as it happens this summer, I slipped on the rocks bathing one day and gave my ankle a nasty turn. Melchett had noticed that she walked with a slight limp. Naturally, that put a stop to the dancing for a bit, and it was rather awkward. I didn't want the hotel to get someone else in my place. That's always a danger. For a minute her good-natured blue eyes were hard and sharp. She was the female fighting for existence. Thought they might queer your pitch, you see, so I thought of Ruby and suggested to the manager that I should get her down. I'd carry on with the hostess business and the bridge and all that. Ruby would just take on the dancing. Keep it in the family, if you see what I mean. Well, they agreed, and I wired to Ruby and she came down. Rather a chance for her, much better class than anything she'd ever done before. That was about a month ago. Colonel Melchett said, I understand, and she was a success. Took that nasal spray. I'm sorry, I'm always doing this. My nose itches like crazy. I think it's the vibrations when I talk or something. I don't know. I'm not allergic to the fibers. So. But what is it? Flonase. It does go down your throat and nasty taste in your mouth. Oh, yes, Josie said carefully. She went down quite well. She doesn't dance as well as I do, but Raymond's clever and carried her through, and she's quite nice looking. She was quite nice looking, you know. Slim and fair and baby looking. Overdid the makeup a bit. I was always on her about that, but you know what girls are. She was only 18 at that age. They always go and overdo it. It doesn't do for a good class place like the Majestic. I was always ticking her off about it and getting her to tone it down. Melchett asked, people liked her? Oh, yes. Mind you, Ruby hadn't got much comeback. She was a bit dumb. She went down better with the older gentlemen than with the young ones. Had she got any special friends? The girl's eyes met his with complete understanding. Not in the way you mean, or at any rate not that I knew about, but then you see she wouldn't tell me. Just for a moment Melchett wondered why not. Josie did not give the impression of being a strict disciplinarian, but he only said, will you describe to me now when you last saw your cousin? Last night. She and Raymond do 2 exhibition dances, one at 10:30 and the other at midnight. They finished the first one. After it, I noticed Ruby dancing with one of the young men staying at the hotel. I was playing bridge with some people in the lounge. There's a glass panel between the lounge and the ballroom. That's the last time I saw her. Unknown caller. These dang scam calls. I was playing bridge. Glass panel between the lounge and the ballroom. That's the last time I saw her. Just after midnight, Raymond came up in a terrible taking, said where was Ruby? She hadn't turned up and it was time to begin. I was vexed. I can tell you that's the sort of silly things girls do and get the management's backs up and then they get the sack. I went up with him to her room. She wasn't there. I noticed that she'd changed. The dress she'd been dancing in, a sort of pink foamy thing with full skirts, was lying over a chair. Usually she kept the same dress on unless it was the special dance night, Wednesdays that is. I'd no idea where she'd got to. We got the band to play one more foxtrot, still no Ruby, so I said to Raymond I'd do the exhibition dance with him. We chose one that was easy on my ankle and made it short, but it played up my ankle pretty badly all the same. It's all swollen this morning. Still, Ruby didn't show up. We set about waiting up for her until 2 o'clock. Furious with her, I was. Her voice vibrated slightly. Melchett caught the note of real anger in it. Just for a moment, he wondered. The reaction seemed a little more intense than was justified by the facts. He had a feeling of something deliberately left unsaid, he said. He said, and this morning, when Ruby Keene had not returned and her bed had not been slept in, you went to the police? He knew from Slack's brief telephone message from Dannemouth that this was not the case. But he wanted to hear what Josephine Turner would say. She did not hesitate. She said, "No, I didn't." "Why not, Miss Turner?" Her eyes met his frankly. She said, "You wouldn't in my place." "You think not?" Josie said, "I've got my job to think about. The one thing a hotel doesn't want is scandal, especially anything that brings in the police. I didn't think anything had happened to Ruby, not a minute. I thought she'd just made a fool of herself about some young man. I thought she'd turn up all right, and I was going to give her a good dressing down when she did. Girls of 18 are such fools." Melchett pretended to glance through his notes. "Ah, yes, I see. It was a Mr. Jefferson who went to the police. One of the guests staying at the hotel?" Josephine Turner said shortly, "Yes." Colonel Melchett asked, "What made this Mr. Jefferson do that?" Josie was stroking the cuff of her jacket. There was a constraint in her manner. Again, Colonel Melchett had a feeling that something was being withheld. She said rather sullenly, "He's an invalid. He gets all het up rather easily, being an invalid, I mean." Melchett passed on from that. He asked, "Who was the young man with whom you last saw your cousin dancing?" "His name's Bartlett. He'd been there about 10 days. Were they on very friendly terms?" "Not specially, I should say. Not that I knew, anyway." About a curious note of anger in her voice. "What does he have to say?" "Said that after their dance, Ruby went upstairs to powder her nose." That was when she changed her dress?" "I suppose so, and that's the last thing you know. After that, she just vanished," said Josie. "That's right." "Did Miss Keene know anybody in St. Mary Mead or in this neighborhood?" "I don't know. She may have done. You see, quite a lot of young men come into Dannemouth to the Majestic from all round about. I wouldn't know where they lived unless they happened to mention it." "Did you ever hear your cousin mention Gossington?" "Gossington?" Josie looked patently puzzled. "Gossington Hall." She shook her head. "Never heard of it." Her tone carried conviction. There was curiosity in it, too. "Gossington Hall," explained Colonel Melchett, "is where her body was found." "Gossington Hall." She stared. "How extraordinary." Melchett thought to himself, "Extraordinary's the word." Aloud, he said, "Do you know a Colonel or Mrs. Bantry?" Again Josie shook her head. "Or Mr. Basil Blake?" She frowned slightly. "I think I've heard that name. Yes, I'm sure I have. But I don't remember anything about him." The diligent Inspector Slack slid across his superior officer a page torn from the notebook. On it was penciled, "Colonel Bantry dined at Majestic last week." Melchett looked up and met the inspector's eye. The chief constable flushed. Slack was an industrious and zealous officer, and Melchett disliked him a good deal, but he could not disregard the challenge. The inspector was tacitly accusing him of favoring his own class, of shielding an old school tie. He turned to Josie. "Miss Turner, I should like you, if you do not mind, to accompany me to Gossington Hall." Coldly defiant, almost ignoring Josie's murmur of assent, Melchit's eyes met Slack's. And that's it. And I'll stop there. That's it for chapter 3. So, good Lord willing, we'll read 4 tomorrow. And I hope you have a wonderfully crafty day. And if you're not busy, hopefully Dana, Triple C, Creatively Created Crochet, will have her making meet today at 5:30 Eastern Time. So I'm going to go put on a little face as I might go up on the panel. Look how much I've got done on this. This takes me forever, the hat band. I had to frog it, and it is a pain in the tail to frog. Kim told me that. It's so pretty. I really love this one. I mean, this is gorgeous colors, bright colors, but I love these colors together. And this one is called Rosewood, and this one is called Violet Blooms. Both at Michael's. And boy, did I have vouchers. So I win again. So I got fiber for the next few lives. If I just show one color at a time, which is what I should always do. Alright, I love y'all. Hope to see you at Dana's Creatively Created Crochet. She's usually on till Sandy comes on at 8, if Sandy's back left us right from her cruise. I'm thinking she may be by now. I'm not sure. But anyway, see you there, I hope. Love ya. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. Bye-bye.